Hello and welcome to another episode of The Zoo. My name is Alf Abuhajleh, and today I'm here with Jon Hall to talk about the difference between ITSM and ITIL. I myself have always struggled to understand really what the difference is. Just kidding. But even though people might have a pretty good idea what separates these two ideas and concepts, it's not always to understand how they come together. So we're going to spend the next half an hour or so talking about the differences and the similarities and how they work together. And no one that I know is better to talk about this than my good friend Jon. Welcome to the zoo, Jon.
Good morning, Alf. Thank you very much.
I understand you had a long flight over, so I hope you're feeling good.
Yeah, the long flight wasn't so bad. It was the 3.5 hour red eye from San Francisco to Chicago last night that can be a little challenging. But doing good. We lost Alf there for a moment.
I don't know what happened. I didn't do anything.
So yeah, it's, when I come over to the US working, I tend to try and do as much as possible so that I don't have to do too many of the big trips. So yeah, I'm becoming quite known for doing crazy west to east red eyes and seeing customers and things on the East Coast on the way back in body, if not in mind. Feeling okay.
Well, let's jump right into it and start really with ITSM, and maybe you can explain to the audience what IT service management is and where it came from.
Yeah, you'll find this is one of those questions you'll get a lot of different answers for, and they're probably all worded differently. They're generally the same. To me, the most simple answer is that it's a phrase that describes the managerial aspects of delivering IT, and that's a broad term, managerial, because I think it includes both, the front end customer facing elements, managing their issues, managing the general experience that IT's customers, which could be internal people, could be external people, have, but also managing the back end governing and processing. So you see, even then I've turned a simple answer into a complex one. ITIL themselves, they have a definition that I had to scribble this on a note because it's got long words in it. The implementation and management of quality IT services that meet the needs of the business. Again, it's quite...
Say that again?
The implementation and management of quality IT services that meet the needs of the business. I did it without my notes. I should have just been confident.
Yeah. It's actually not bad when you listen to it carefully.
No, but one of my favorite, when I had a quick look online to see what other people were saying, and Stephen Mann, who's an old acquaintance of many of us, an old friend of many of us, he worked for Forrester. He's worked for various companies in the industry, and he has a page, exploring the definition of ITSM, and the point he makes on his blog is he finds 5 or 6 different wordings of pretty much the same thing. I think generally that ITIL answer is pretty good.
Yeah. Well, you have a new, not so new, but you have a young child at home.
Mm-hmm, indeed.
Well, is it a boy or girl?
He's a boy, little boy.
I should know this.
Just over 2.
When he's 10 and he asks, Daddy, what is ITSM? What would you say? Because now we're talking to my level, okay?
Yeah, you see, this is one thing that preys on my mind because my dad was a ferry captain. He drove a big ship, so that was easy, and a lot of the kids at school had dads in that industry or mums in that. It was a coal mining area, and that was pretty clear as well. It does interest me that I've spent 20 odd years now working in ITSM. What have I actually been? How would I explain what we've been doing? But it's actually been really cool because we've a lot of us have been lucky enough to kind of move through this development of ITSM into I think a very, very credible, well thought out profession. Whereas 20 years ago, a lot of this stuff was being done completely ad hoc. It really was sticky notes on desks and rows on spreadsheets and having to know who to call to get anything done. So yeah, whether I'll be able to hold a 10-year-old's attention in that conversation compared to my dad drives a ship, I don't know. But it's been pretty. It's been actually a really interesting time to watch IT develop.
Yeah. Now, when I explain at home to my daughters, I'd say, all those computers? Yeah, I'll make sure they run. And then I'll leave it at that. and I think that's something to that, although God knows it's way more complex. And when I first got into ITSM almost a decade ago, I did not know how deep it was. And And that's when I stumble upon, which will take us to the next topic, ITIL, that framework that we rely on, or some of us rely on, to manage IT in the enterprise. So tell me a little bit, what is ITIL? Where did that? It's a British invention, right?
It is. It's a British export. Can you believe it? It sometimes feels like there's not that many of those anymore. ITIL, although you can track this kind of thinking back past ITIL. IBM in the 1970s were developing an internal methodology about managing IT systems, and then they published something in about 1980 called the Information Systems Management Architecture. So that ITIL, I think it's fair to say, built on some of the work that was done by companies like that were really starting to think, hey, we should have more formal, thought through ways of dealing with all this technology that's starting to sprawl around the business. I mean, it wasn't sprawling in the 1970s like it is today, but nevertheless, there was almost an industrial revolution on the horizon. In fact, I'd argue it probably has been.
Yeah.
The British government then, through the civil service, started to encapsulate this in their own way. And so ITIL really kind of came along later in that decade, later in the 80s in its first nascent form. By the time I got involved, I started work out of university in 94. ITIL had really it was on version 2, and it had started to form up into quite a credible and understandable set of disciplines, 10 disciplines in 2 broad areas. And that really became a success. It really, it gave people an answer to something I think they were really looking for, which is how do we stop putting Post-it notes on our desk when someone calls us with an issue? How do we stop having to understand which person we have to talk to get something done in a back-end system? And importantly, how do we stop changing things making changes in IT that wipe out our systems and start hurting people? And it really rolled out from Britain in round about the mid-90s. I think I read somewhere, and I'm not sure if it's true, it wasn't really possible to validate this, but that the first ITIL classes were taught in America in 1995.
So it took quite a while, because
yeah,
the whole wasn't there some kind of, one of our viewers is talking about the CCTA, the Central Computer and Telecommunication Agency, being part of the government's attempt to centralize all this. And that was in the 80s, and it took till the 90s before it reached America. So
that's unless anybody can tell me I'm wrong on that one. That seems to certainly been the case. I mean, back then I wasn't working for an American company like I am now, so it's a little. We had working for a British company that was very, very bought into ITIL from that time in the mid 90s. So I had an interesting perspective. We kind of grew everything up from scratch. We talked about progressing through a status we call control status through to starting to develop processes. Someone described control status as understanding where on earth we are now. But yeah, and there were some quite pioneering companies. I worked for a company that had spun out of British Telecoms, where it had the connection back to the UK civil service, because BT was only really privatized in the 80s. Yeah, and then suddenly this quiet, this quiet department in the UK civil service had created something that went truly global. Truly global. I mean, it's as I'm sure we'll talk about, it's not the only game in town and never was, but it really did become, I think, in the collective consciousness of the ITSM industry, the most widely recognized and used standard framework.
And ITIL is a set of books. I flipped through them. And if anyone has insomnia, I strongly recommend it. It's amazing reading. But it doesn't really tell you how to do things, but it does give you recommendation how processes should be followed somehow.
And there's different. I always think there's different levels of framework and structure that. So some things are very, very up high, very up in the air. These are goals that we want to achieve. These are ways of doing them. I think sometimes things like there's a standard called ISO 20000, which is not dissimilar to ITIL, but probably sits at a slightly higher level. It's more these are sort of goals, these are rules of engagement, and ITIL can plug in quite neatly to that. You have other standards which are very, very prescriptive. This is exactly how things are done. ITIL I've always thought of as being somewhere in the middle. it absolutely doesn't tell you everything you need to do, but a lot of organizations you can map people's job titles to things in the ITIL books very easily. You know, the change manager, the service desk manager, the availability manager, all these different roles that fit very squarely to ITIL disciplines. And those disciplines, they can act, I see them as acting as a little like a job description for each of those jobs. That's how it manifests itself in organizations a lot. So yeah, it's not 100% prescriptive, and you don't really have to do it all or do it quite to the letter, but it's more than just a kind of aspirational high-level framework as well.
So how do they work together? Is ITIL the recipe and ITSM are the produce, or how does this work?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, ITSM happens to some extent anyway. Whether it happens badly or well, it depends. But I remember talking to a customer a couple of years ago who said something which really resonated, which is that if you ask my management, we don't do problem management yet. We haven't done, we're doing ITIL adoption, ITSM adoption, we do incident management, we do a bit of change management, we don't do problem. That's what they'll tell you. But we do problem management, because there are always blocks of incidents sitting in our queue that have been there a long time, all around the same subject, because nobody, something has to happen to fix them that takes time to plan and manage, and someone has to work out what that is. So actually we're doing problem management. It's just, we're not officially doing that part of ITSM.
That's interesting. I spoke to someone who was saying they're putting in a big effort to do more knowledge management, the whole KCSM, whatever. And then so you use this for problem management. And I said, no, we don't. I said, but really, you're documenting the problem and you're solving them long term this way. And they go, oh, we never thought about that. We're actually doing both. So it is very incestuous, the whole ITSM framework and ITIL underlying framework.
So how they work together, I mean, it depends how consciously you're making them work together. Everyone who's delivering IT to a business is having to manage it in some way, and really, I think ITIL has been a way of making, componentizing things in a little way, understanding what you're doing and understanding how things need to work, should ideally work together, to put a little bit of structure around something that otherwise would be happening, but happening in a very chaotic way.
So if I try to put change management in place, do I start while looking at ITIL and understanding what the concepts of change management is before I just turn on whatever vendor solution I have running at home?
I think a lot of people will do that, but maybe this is the product manager in me. I think we should start from the problem and work inwards. But what you've just described, I'm sure, happens a lot. I think ideally, something like change management is quite an intrusive process to people's roles if you don't sell it right. I've run systems, and the easiest thing in the world, hey, we've got to change, something needs to change in the system, let's just do it. And having to then instead be told, no, I can't just do it, I have to log a request to do it and explain myself and justify myself potentially to a room full of other people. And then I might get permission to do it, but when somebody says it's okay to do it. So if you start from that kind of process end, it can feel quite prescriptive to users. So I would start ideally by saying, look, we have had, let's make some numbers up. In the last year, we had 100 major system issues. And this is something that is almost certainly the case in most organizations. If you take 100 things, 90 of them were caused by somebody changing something that had unforeseen consequences. I mean, there's probably another 10 that, you can't quite account for the contractor on the building site next door putting a cable through a digger through a cable all the time. You can plan around it, and that's what comes into other areas of ITIL. But if we're just talking about change management, it can be a tough sell, and so starting with the problem, there is a problem. We have a problem. Failed changes are a major problem. If you look out, if you pick up the newspaper, read the paper, see the latest major outage in an ATM network or an airline or whatever, usually it boils down to a failed change.
It always is. It always is. I mean, you go to Expedia's not running. Well, we had an upgrade last night and it didn't go well.
Absolutely,
it's invariable, yeah.
And it's usually spun in the media, and unforeseen consequences of an upgrade or
exactly, yeah.
Or, a patch that went wrong.
Yeah.
So that's how I think with all these disciplines, the best practice, the most successful organizations have understood why they need to do this, and they've sold that very well because it is a cultural change for people.
Yeah.
Change management is a great example of one that needs serious cultural change, and yet the benefits really, ultimately there's a big benefit in that those people who want to do that change system will probably find themselves on call less on a Friday night, facing their whole weekend being wiped out by a big system restoration. It will maybe not ever go away, but hopefully there'll be a lot less of it. And as somebody now with a 2-year-old boy, I've seen plenty of people who also have young kids in that situation, facing long weekends of pain and suffering and pizza.
There are other frameworks than ITIL out there, isn't there? What are some of them, and how do
there certainly are. I mean, I've mentioned ISO 20000, which isn't necessarily, it's not mutually exclusive. What
is that?
It's like all these ISO things, it evolved from again, quite often government-based standards bodies. So it is a set of, it's like a lot of other ISOs, it's a defined set of certifiable standards that, I think another one, it actually came out of the British Standards Institute. We seem to, if the one thing we import is that, then fair enough.
Well, you always have, in the olden days, you came up with the meters and the yards and all this. You did help us, especially after the Enlightenment era, help us standardize, and you just can't stop doing so.
I'm not sure that, and these days I'm not sure that.
Versus Americans who would never be the one who standardize everything.
I always thought the imperial measurement system was actually a cruel practical joke played on the world that went a little bit wrong. Everyone took it a bit seriously, but yeah, okay. So ISO 20000 is an interesting one. There are some other frameworks. I mean, we often see COBIT, which is much more of a kind of operational governance focused framework, but again, there's huge similarities with ITIL. So sometimes it can be quite a challenge sitting the two things together, but ultimately they're doing a little bit of, the general intention is the same. We work with a lot of telcos, of course, and there's, for at least as long as I've been working with ITIL, there's been ETOM, a telecom operations management standard. And that again, its intentions are broadly similar. It's a little bit hard to map one-to-one to ITIL, and ETOM is a lot more focused on telecom service offerings and the management of those. But often, as that kind of equipment converges, as more and more telco stuff is just basically computer stuff, there's more and more companies looking at aligning those two. And then actually, it's fair to say, ITIL right now is in a bit of a transitional phase because the industry is transitioning so fast.
What's happening there?
Well, I've already mentioned the telco. The fact that so much telco stuff is now IP enabled. So suddenly there's collisions of standards from two industries that need to figure out how to work together. You've also got a big shift. Pick another big change. There's so many big changes going on, but one very fundamental one is the move towards much more continuous delivery of software, continuous development, continuous delivery. And that I've seen creating some interesting cultural challenges in ITIL organizations where, the change process typically has a lead time of maybe days or a week from logging the change, a minimum lead time between logging a significant change at least and executing it, and approvals in the middle. But now we see companies like Amazon deploying 20,000, 30,000 changes to their code a day, and maybe it's even more than that now in production. And
Facebook,
and of course they're at the leading edge. They're right at the other edge of things. They built that entire culture from the ground upwards. But it's very, very common now for me to. I went to visit a big travel company in the UK last week, and they have a separate department, almost a separate business unit in their IT organization. So they have. It's very much an example of what Gartner are calling bimodal IT. They have the word traditional is a bit of a loaded word, but I'll use it. They have that kind of more traditional IT setup, but they also have this very, very agile team that is designed for rapid innovation, rapid delivery. And now they're figuring out how to amalgamate the two together. So ITIL itself is almost, I'll use the word pressure. I mean, if you go to a kind of DevOps continuous development conferences, which I occasionally pop in on because it's very important, I think, to follow that trend, you can certainly get this notion that ITIL is something in the way amongst that community. But then some of the real big founders of that movement, like Gene Kim, who wrote the Phoenix Project, have written plenty of things saying, no, ITIL is not incompatible with this. It's just, you have to just map it in a slightly different way.
Do you see, or do you know if ITIL will, because will it evolve with this rapid development? And rapid is an understatement.
Yeah.
It's like it went from one release every 3 months to 1,000 every month. So, how...
It absolutely has to evolve, because this is the reality. This is how a lot of software is going to be delivered. We see a big shift now towards, in this digital enterprise, companies are going to differentiate themselves by writing their own software at the point of their front end delivery, or consuming much more innovative software and doing things quickly. And so it has to evolve. And we're now seeing, there's an interesting framework that's out there and being worked on by a lot of the same people who seen in the ITIL space over the years, called IT for IT, which is more, I think, to me, it seems more, it takes a lot of the ITIL principles, but it puts them more in a kind of continuous structure. It's more about planning, building, delivering, running. And I think being able to establish that in a very parallel way across different services will help bring these ITIL principles to the new world. How this pans out, I'm not sure. I mean, we certainly still hear about ITIL all the time, but if you talk to Gartner, and I've had Gartner people say they get a few less calls now about ITIL, and many more calls about. These calls aren't asking for ITIL; they're asking for something different. And I think we're going to spend a few years in the industry either evolving ITIL or having to figure out something new. I think ITIL can and will evolve.
There's a couple of other things I want to talk about, but while we're on this topic, the latest, the new kid on the block is SIAM, Service Integration Management, whatever.
Yeah, and
where does that fit? Yeah. So
SIAM I think it sits somewhere towards doing everything in house and the total outsourcer model that when we saw. A decade ago, a huge number of companies outsourced almost everything, handed everything over to service integrators and providers, who, generally speaking, were very, very built around ITIL, in my experience. Yeah. And they could use ITIL as a way of selling their services. Hey, you can buy change management off us, you can buy problem off us, which worked good for them, I think. But again, maybe because of this need for companies to be differentiating themselves at the technology front end, at the line of business, a lot of those companies are pulling everything back in-house again now. That the pure outsource model is not being very successful at the moment, in my opinion. And so SIAM is a bit more.
Why not? What is it?
Well, you've got no control. I mean, if your company, in a nutshell, if you've decided that you want to be that great new digital company, and don't forget, we see now we interact with very traditional companies in very new ways. Like we said, I flew on a plane last night. I didn't touch a piece of paper. I did everything on from the moment the ticket was booked on our travel system at work, which could do with a little bit of the
lipstick. Yeah, no.
Never mind. But from that moment, I've got the United Airlines app. So United, I flew. I'm flying home tomorrow night on a 767. That's probably 24, 25 years old. That is definitely legacy technology. I'd like to tell myself if it's been up that long, it must be pretty good. But I do everything on a mobile phone app that's really nice. I can change my seat. When I hit that change my seat button, let's think there's 50 different IT systems have just been touched in one click there, but all I have to do is one click. And then, I can get my boarding pass. I can review my frequent flyer stuff. I can request an upgrade. I can even see, for that plane, what's going to be on that plane. Is there going to be Wi-Fi? Is there going to be, is there going to be entertainment? So all that stuff is a very different and differentiating experience. That is a company that is changing from an airline company to a airline and software company, and right across vast swathes of the industry, across vast swathes of every industry. The companies are finding that this is the new expectation. We're all walking around with little supercomputers in our pocket that are really lovely to interact with, and we want to deal with companies that way. So there's a long answer to a short question, I know, but the challenges for companies, if we've outsourced everything, how do we what can we do? How do we do that? You know, we could pay someone to build that app, but then we're in a long development cycle. So the general trend has been for people to pull a lot of this back in-house and, you know, outsource the stuff that isn't really core to their business, but bring in-house the things that is. And that kind of moves us towards SIAM, where they may still be paying an outsourced integrator company to manage things, but the company's not managing everything. They're managing different towers of service. You know? So I'm an airline. I don't want to do networking. I'll outsource the networking. I do want to do application development. I'll bring that in-house. Maybe I want to retain my own customer service center, but I will outsource some of the other elements of operations. So all these things that do fit together in an ITSM environment are now a mishmash of internal and external. And the SIAM provider is the body that is in charge of pulling that into a cohesive form. So again, it's not incompatible with ITIL by any means. And ITIL has always talked about defining services and understanding them and managing them.
Well, and that's actually an interesting point. So ITIL, it is a large framework. Two things. Do I have to take the whole enchilada, or can I just pick and choose what I need as I evolve my IT service management? And in implementing or bringing ITIL in as the underlying framework when I manage the digital enterprise today, does that bring on a lot of changes, cultural changes, and so on? So
yeah, you certainly don't have to do everything all at once, and no company, I don't think anybody would ever be successful trying to launch into all, you know, nearly 30 ITIL disciplines at once. Really, the classic kind of evolution path into this is to start at the service desk. And I think partly that's the most customer visible thing, but also it's often where the most obvious, immediate, addressable pain is. And then once companies have established a good degree of control and formalized the service desk, they start moving then maybe into either problem or change management, because, you know, as you said, problems going to be happening anyway, because you're going to have lots of tickets that are just sitting there with somebody needing to proactively manage them. Change is about reducing a lot of the risk that leads to those incidents. So that's quite a logical path. And then it really depends where companies want to go. I mean, I think often things like availability management come in, configuration management, these things that are about understanding and getting the best out of the actual infrastructure that provides these services. And around those things, as those are evolving, the very notion of defining what are our services, you know, understanding the portfolio, we do all this stuff, how do we divide that into understandable services that we can manage? And so that is often an evolution over a couple of years. And then really, you know, with that framework in place, we often see companies then really start branching out and formalizing the rest. But to be honest, I think it's quite rare to find someone who would tick every single box in ITIL and say, yeah, we do every single one of these. Yeah, I think that would be an edge case.
And it's not an overnight change, so there isn't a major disruption for the end user, the employers or the customers and so on.
Yeah, it needs significant backing from management, because we are asking people to do things in a different and more structured way.
Yeah.
Say that classic example of, you know, change management, where suddenly I can't just go and do the stuff I'm good at doing. I have to go through a governed process. I mean, without management oversight and, frankly, serious disincentives to still go and do your own thing, that can't establish. So the cultural change has to come right from the top with these things.
You talk to a lot of enterprises, and some of them are using ITIL, some of them are not, some are using a little bit. Is there success correlation to using ITIL? If I start to implementing, if I'm watching this and I'm on the fence and we're doing a little bit of it, but really want to get into it, is it worth it? Will it help me over the long term?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's unquestionable. We see, and again, you know, there's so many stories and different objectives that people have set out to do. But if you look at things like the results on the frontline service desk, it's very, very common for a really good ITIL program to actually, you know, generate demonstrable results. I like to think customer satisfaction is probably the first thing to think, rather than numerative measures like number of tickets. But nevertheless, we
sold 100 tickets more this month, but people don't like us. Yeah, well.
Oh, the thing is, I mean, there's actually one thing I have seen as an unintended consequence. When the service desk gets better, it suddenly starts taking more tickets because people are actually more willing to call something they think is going to do something for them. So pure measures like that are not always great. But on the other hand, we have a story on our website about a large company in China who halved the number of incidents and halved the time to resolve those incidents with a structured ITSM program. So that's double good. That's not just a good number outcome. Things are being fixed quicker. You can't hide behind the time to resolution.
Yeah, that's good.
People show, and the examples that we often see. Typically, change management will reduce failed changes considerably, 40% or more, which is a vast difference to the impact that kind of problem has on the company. So we've got a number of stories on our website, and lots of other people, consultancies and vendors in this space too. And it's one of those things where there's no guarantees. You can't just plug in a tool, switch it on, walk away and leave the staff with it and assume that's going to change everything. Tools are part of the process. Management, oversight, governance are all part of the process. Done well, it very, very frequently shows good results.
Yeah. Well, with the explosion of online services and online shopping, and I live in a remote area where we don't have shopping, but I have 2 teenage daughters. So trust me, FedEx and UPS come every day. My wife, who does most of the shopping, doesn't pick stores or service providers based on their offerings. One thing and one thing only, their customer service. So if they can't process her request, if they don't know her information, if they can't offer her notification on a mobile phone, she's not buying with it. Simple as that, right? And so and there's very, very few who can do that. And as you said, that's not that easy to do because, for the end user, it looks like there's one system, one web page. Behind that web page are 10, 15 systems hooked together, maybe more systems hooked together. And then you have the outside suppliers. So having something as old and stoogey as ITIL come back and actually have almost a comeback, if you will, and become more than just this library, but actually becoming a religion to some, seems to be a necessity if we're going to enter into this digital enterprise, because we can't wing it. We have to do it properly.
There's nowhere to hide from that feedback anymore either.
No.
So one of the big growth areas in ITSM right now is customer self-service and enabling that kind of one-click. I don't want to, as a customer, no more do I want to fill out something that looks like my tax form just to say that.
Even your tax form don't look like your tax form. You now do your taxes.
Now you want to hit a button. That Uber type experience where I used to have to fill in 4 pages on a web page to book a taxi from our San Jose office, and now if I wanted, I could just hit a button and get an Uber. Yeah. So, and the other thing is the feedback is so vocal now. You mentioned looking at services. How many of us ever book a hotel anymore without checking something like TripAdvisor just to make sure it's not a horror show? It's one of the things that service organizations really. That's why I'm always advocating focus on metrics like this. The end result, like customer satisfaction. It's not just a counter. That's an area that really, really is growing within ITSM. That provision of a really great customer experience. I think it reflects in. We've aimed to reflect that in the tools we're building. We take a product like Remedy and we focus entirely now on the customer experience, the user experience, and that drives what we do with the tool. In whatever else happens to ITIL and ITSM, I think that area can only continue to get more important.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, thank you, Jon. It's been a real pleasure talking to you about ITIL and ITSM. I didn't think it was going to be this fun until that much. But it's always great to have you in the zoo, so thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Al.
For the rest of you out there, take care. Be safe. Bye-bye.